Welcome ladies and gentlemen, this is Mon, and in this video we're gonna go over the brand new sniper rifle, a Frost Vortex rifle, the SKS Pathfinder. Now before jumping into the weapon features to understand how the weapon works, do let me know in the comments down below what video you'd like to see next. And now starting with the weapon features, first feature, triggers Frost Vortex on hit with a cooldown of 5 seconds, and each hit reduces the cooldown by 1 second. So far so good, it should be pretty easy to understand. If you don't know what Frost Vortex is, it's essentially an AoE status damage / elemental damage effect of dot that inflicts 50% psi intensity per 0.5 seconds for 4 seconds within a 4.5 meters radius. And only up to one Frost Vortex can exist at any time, and that damage is a Frost element, cannot crit, cannot strike weak spots, and will not decay with distance. So essentially, when you shoot at enemy, you will spawn Frost Vortex, which is this dot right here. Then, 60% chance per hit to generate deviant particles, and picking them up puts you in a charging state, max health particles plus 10. So essentially, this feature makes it so that when you hit an enemy, you will have chances to spawn these deviant particles, and you will be able to hold up to 14 particles. Here it does say max health particles plus 10, but in reality, you're able to hold up to 14 particles. Then, when in charged state, consume deviant particles for a charged shot, launching a penetrating ice spike, dealing ice elemental damage equal to 110% attack, which benefits from Frost Vortex damage bonus and deals 20% damage to metas. So this is essentially the bread and butter of this weapon. Now don't make any mistake, this is not an AoE attack. This 110% attack is only applied to the enemy that you shoot at. We're going to dive into how that 110% attack is calculated in order to understand how to build the weapon. But right before we do that, let's just go over the last weapon feature, which is ice elemental damage plus 30%, and each charged shot increases ice elemental damage by 8% for 15 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. And so now let's deal some damage and understand how the weapon scaling works. But before I actually do that, let's just take a look at what I have equipped right now. So currently I have a Cryo Catalyst mod, which gives me some stats right here. I also have 3 treacherous pieces to give me 50% weapon and status damage bonus, and I have a Weakspot damage boost mod. And so here, if I start shooting at the dummy and get some stacks right now, I have 5 stacks. Let's start shooting. I'm dealing 7,765 damage. And if we take a look at our stat sheet, you'll see that we have 959 attack, we have 84% weak spot damage bonus, 62.3% weapon damage bonus, 50% status damage bonus, 78.7% frost elemental damage bonus, 21% frost vortex keyword damage bonus, and 14% damage bonus against common enemies. So how is that mathed out? This is equal to your attack times the 1.1 because it deals 110% of your attack, times 1.84, which is my weak spot damage bonus, times 1.623, which is my weapon damage bonus, then times 1.787, which is my elemental damage bonus, then times 1.21, which was my Frost Vortex keyword damage bonus, and lastly times 1.14, which was my damage bonus against common enemies. And just like that, we find ourselves with 7,765 damage. You might have noticed that the 50% status damage isn't in the formula, and that's because those ice spikes that you shoot do not scale off of status damage. There's also another multiplier that I left out, which is the crit damage part. Now to spoil you a little bit, the ice spikes actually do scale off of crit. So if I just land a crit hit right now, you'll see that here I just dealt 9,453 damage. What's my crit damage? My crit damage is at 40%. So if we just take this formula and then we paste it down here, and then we add the crit damage to the weak spot damage, because don't forget, crit damage and weak spot damage is additive in this game, you'll see that we deal 9,453 damage, which corresponds to the damage that we were dealing. And so essentially the bread and butter of this weapon, where most of your damage is going to come from, will scale off of crit, weak spot, weapon, and elemental. So elemental sources as in elemental damage, and Frost Vortex keyword damage sources. And so now that we understand how the weapon scales, you should know that this weapon scales off of your attack. And so your weapon blueprint, which means that the blueprint of the rifle, is going to be what matters most. Of course, your armor blueprints still matter because the weapon still deals Frost Vortex damage, which scales off of psi intensity, but it's going to be a little less important. Now, This guide will be separated into two different sections because this weapon can be built in two different ways, a crit build and a weak spot / weapon / elemental build. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first go over components that apply to both builds, then I'll go over the crit build, and lastly, I will tell you about the modifications to the crit build that you need to make in order to have the weak spot build. So let's get started. Moving on to your accessories, I'm running a stability setup, which would be the integrated flash hider, the compact reflex sight, and the compact infrared indicator. As for the magazine, you're going to want to use tactical sniper mag to gain that extra 15 reload speed. As for the ammo, the best ammo types to use are going to be disintegrating ammo or suppression or penetration ammo. It's going to depend on the content that you do. If you are clearing silos, then you'll want to use either suppression or penetration depending on the type of enemy that you're fighting. But if you're clearing overworld content or if you're clearing monoliths, then use disintegrating sniper ammo. The reason for this is because suppression and penetration ammo do not work in the overworld or in monoliths. Moving on to your deviations, the SKS Pathfinder can make use of a lot of deviations, such as the Snow Sprite, the Lone Wolf, the Zap Cam, and of course the Polar Jelly. Now usually the best option is going to be the Lone Wolf, and the reason for this is because it can draw aggro, which is going to be very important if you play the low HP preset. But not just that, it increases the weapon damage received by the attacked targets by 50%, which here will increase the damage of your ice spikes. So if you're clearing silos and whatnot, usually you'll want to run the Lone Wolf. However, let's say in future there's an enemy that's a flyer, which the Lone Wolf will not be able to reach, then you're going to want to consider the other options. Not really the Polar Jelly, because Polar Jelly requires you to throw it, and not just that, it can only stay at one place. But your other options are going to be the Zap Cam and the Snow Sprite. And just to make it clear, the weakness implant of plus 48% frost damage works the same way as the Lone Wolf's weakness, which means that they will both buff the damage of your penetrating ice spikes. So if it's a flyer and you can't really shoot at it, then you're going to want to prioritize Snow Sprite, but if you don't have a good one, then sure, you could use the Zap Cam, which essentially does the same thing. It's not going to be 48%, it's going to be 43.2%. Moving on to your secondary and melee weapons, starting with your secondary, you will want to choose with either Bingo or Wildfire. So starting with the Bingo, the reason why we want to use this, or really both of these weapons, is because they apply the Bullseye effect, which is 8% vulnerability for 12 seconds, so a damage increase. Now, if the enemy has weak spots and you hit them consistently, then you should prioritize the Bingo, because the Bingo can give you up to 50% weak spot damage bonus just from this effect, which is weak spot damage plus 25%, stacking up to 4 times, but you lose 2 stacks after you swap weapons. You can also get 15% attack if you go through the hassle of killing an enemy with the Bingo. Now, as for the Wildfire, you'd want to use this if the enemy doesn't have any weak spots. Since if the enemy doesn't have weak spots, your weak spot damage bonus is going to be useless, and Wildfire gives you weapon damage, which will still buff your damage. Then moving on to the melee weapon, you will want to prioritize the Kukri. The reason for this is because defeating a target will grant all of your weapons 30% attack multiplier, and not just that, you'll get 15% crit rate, and when you defeat an enemy with a heavy strike, you'll gain 20% psi intensity. And all of these features will essentially increase your damage. Now the way to make the Kukri work is you're going to need an ice spot deviation, which will craft you sticky ice crystals. And how do you use them? Well, you just throw them on the ground, and then you hold your melee button to perform a heavy attack. So just like this, and as you can see here, I've gotten the buff at the bottom corner of my screen, attack plus 30% and crit rate plus 15%. Of course, you also get the psi intensity buff, but it's just not written in the icon. Now, there's also some melee weapon swapping tricks. So for instance, you could proc the long axe buff or the blue cleavers buff and then swap to Kukri and then proc Kukri's buff, but I won't dive into that. Moving on to your key gear, you have two options. You have essentially the Snowdrift top, and you also have the Earthly Boots. And put simply, you should use the Earthly Boots when you're bossing, but when you're not bossing, you should use the Snowdrift top. The reason for this is because when you're bossing, you will gain the most amount of damage bonuses while using Earthly Boots, because it gives you 30% damage, which here is going to count as other damage bonuses, so damage against X type, which is the strongest multiplier since the multiplier you have the least amount of. However, when you're not bossing, then the Snowdrift top will be great, because what it essentially does is when you pick up Deviant Particles, you'll gain an additional charge stack along with some damage bonuses. Now, the damage bonuses aren't better than the earthly boots. So what I would recommend you to do is, for instance, if you're going through a Nightmare Silo, before reaching the boss, you'd want to use the Snowdrift Top to stack up your Deviant Particles, and once you are at the boss room, you just swap to a preset that uses the Earthly Boots. Now, technically, you also have a third option, which would be the Stealth Rocker Wrap, which is the crowd control key gear for Frost Vortex weapons. But at this point, if you want to use this key gear, just don't even consider using the SKS in my opinion, and just use Abyss Glance. You're gonna have much more fun. Now, before I talk about gear set combos, I just want to say that if you wish to see more quality Once Human content, then do like this video, subscribe to my channel, and turn on the bell for future video notifications. Starting with the new strongest low HP preset, it's going to be 3 savior pieces with 2 lone wolf pieces. Now, really quick caveat, if you're not doing the crit build and you're doing the Weakspot build, then obviously you won't want to use Lone Wolf, you'll want to use 2 Treacherous Tides pieces for the 12% weapon and status damage bonus. Because 2 Lone Wolf pieces will give you 10% magazine capacity and 5% crit rate. Now, as for the 3 savior pieces, the 2-piece effect will give you 10% weapon and status damage as long as you're shielded, and the 3-piece effect can give you up to 20% weapon and status damage bonus. But not just that, it'll give you survivability by consuming 8% of your current HP to generate a 5% of max HP shield. Now, this might not seem stronger since from its stat alone, the 3-piece savior gives 30% status and weapon damage bonus, which here also says that you have to stack, though in a bit I'll show that you actually don't need to. Whereas with the 3-piece treacherous, it's instantly 50% weapon and status damage bonus. Now, the reason of the strength of this new preset lies in the better survivability, in my opinion, and also in the better sources of damage, which I'll dive into in a bit. But first, to make this set work, you need to lower your HP down to 1%, which would require you to lower your sanity all the way down to 0%, which would correspond to a max HP reduction of 99%. Now, how do you do that? You can eat food items that reduce your sanity, such as boiled food. If you are a chef, you should craft large boiled water that reduce your sanity by 1000 points. Now, if you don't know how to craft it, you simply go to your stove, go in creative cooking, you put 5 polluted water and 5 dirty water, and there it is, your minus 1000 sanity large boiled water. Now that we've got this part done, let me explain where the other extra damage is coming from. And the first part is from the Rush Hour mod, which would be every 10% HP loss grants a permanent 4% weapon and status damage bonus. Now, with this set, you will be sitting at a 1% permanent HP, which essentially means that you will permanently gain 36% weapon and status damage bonus. And this is going to be better than the 24% that you could get with 3-piece treacherous. Then we also have a new mod suffix, which in the gloves mod is the crescent suffix, which here, as long as you have 40% shield, you will have 10% weapon damage bonus and 25% crit damage bonus, which is better than your normal Vinance suffix stats. Not just that, there are still 2 components. The first one is that you actually don't need to stack up the Savior's 3-piece effect. Here it says when HP is consumed, you'll have to stack up weapon and status damage. But really, if you have a weapon, if your weapon has a mod that gives you max HP, so let's just say this one right here, I have 4.8% max HP, then simply holstering or unholstering the weapon, or swapping between your weapons, as you can see down here, will stack up or refresh the Savior pieces bonus. Now, in my previous video on the PDW90 guide, I was able to do this without a mod that had max HP, but somehow they fixed it or just it stopped working. So here, just a quick easy fix, just get a mod that has max HP. Now, not just that, but you will also have better survivability if you manage your shield well. And what I mean by this is, first of all, in order to survive with like literally 1 HP, you will need the shield, obviously. And so the first part of having better survivability is using Deviant Energy Defense, which will give you a 30% HP, a max HP shield. And now, obviously, if you shoot at enemies, you will start stacking up your shield values, as you can see at the bottom of my screen. But not just that, as a spoiler, for your top mod, you will actually want to run Rejuvenating mod, which is this mod right here. When shield is above 30% of your max HP, defeating an enemy will recover 20% of your max HP. Excess recovery is converted into shield lasting for 20 seconds, with a cooldown of 10 seconds. So what this means is that because your HP is going to be always capped at 1%, if you run Rejuvenating, you will not recover HP, but rather you will get a shield. And now here to show you how the mod's gonna work, essentially just start stacking up your shields so that you have more than 30% of your max HP as shields. Then let's just say that this is an enemy and I defeat it. Boom, right there, I just got a load of shield. Now here it says cooldown of 10 seconds, but funnily enough, there doesn't seem to be a cooldown on this. Like if I just throw another one, you'll see that here I just got an extra amount of shield. Then moving on to the casual low HP preset, it's going to be the usual Treacherous Tides 3-piece, and your 2-piece Lone Wolf if you're doing the crit build, or 2-piece Renegade if you are doing the Weakspot build. So I'm not gonna go in details how Treacherous works, but essentially, Treacherous, you do the same thing as you do with Savior, you reduce your sanity down to 0%, but here it's gonna correspond to a max HP reduction of 60%, which is just gonna leave your HP here, and just like that, you will gain a permanent 50% weapon and status damage bonus. Now, as for the 2-piece Lone Wolf, it'll grant you 5% crit rate and 10% magazine capacity bonus, which are both important for your crit build. Now, if you're doing the weak spot build, you'll want to go with Renegade for the weak spot damage bonus and the reload speed bonus. Then moving on to the high HP preset, this time it's actually going to be the same as the super low HP preset with one key difference. You will no longer reduce your sanity down to 0%, and voila, there's your high HP preset. Now sure, the 3-piece Savior will still cost you HP to shoot, but it's still converted into shield, so here's what you can do. If you do the 3-piece Savior with 2-piece Treacherous, essentially, you, instead of like having 1 HP here, you'll still have HP here, which is you're still staying at a high HP percentage. However, the thing is, the shield from your Savior isn't invincible, and sometimes you'll take damage and whatnot, and to get it back up, you need to keep shooting, which will drain your HP. So one option that you could do is not just run 3 Savior pieces, you could run the 4th piece, which will automatically use the least potent activator in your backpack when your HP is below 30%. Now here you're gonna left with 1 piece left, and simply just fill that role with Lone Wolf to give you extra magazine capacity bonus. But yeah, really the key difference is that for the high HP preset, do not reduce your sanity. And let's say you are doing events that actually reduce your sanity, such as the Lunar Revelry. One thing you can do is by simply crafting Malt Ale, which will prevent your sanity from dropping, though it will have to take up a drink slot. Now moving on to your mask hide, the mask hide that you're going to want to prioritize is going to be the Starfall Cowhide, which is weapon damage plus 8% when your stamina is at 120 or higher, and the effect doubles while you're airborne, so if you just jump, you will get 16% weapon damage bonus. Now, if you don't like the condition of needing the extra stamina or having to jump around, then you'll want to opt in for Lucky Rabbit Fur, which would be after scoring a crit. What is this? Okay. After scoring a crit, elemental damage plus 10% for 3 seconds. Moving on to your Cradle perks, you will want to have anti-phase for the sniper rifle damage bonus and for the damage bonus against phase anomalies. Then you'll want tactical combo for the weapon damage bonus, status enhancement for the status damage bonus, elemental sense for the elements damage bonus, and extreme freezing for the same thing as well, which these two are both going to give you frost vortex keyword damage bonus. Then you will want deviant energy defense, which is going to be very important for your survivability. Now you still have 2 more options, and here you can juggle between resilience, shield protection, and marked strike. So resilience, you should take this if you want the survivability, but if you really don't need it, then you'll want shield protection and marked strike. So marked strike gives you 20% weak spot against marked enemies, and shield protection makes it so that when you have a shield that is above 40% of your max HP, then you'll gain 10% damage reduction and 10% damage to all type of enemies in the game. Though of course, if you're not able to get a 40% shield, a 40% max HP shield, then don't even bother with this, just go with resilience. Moving on to your food buffs, starting with the food slot, if you are bossing, then you will want to prioritize mixed fried hot dog and then also eat bone-in deviated sausage if you are a chef. The reason for this is because both the damage bonuses of these food buffs count as other damage bonus, which here count as damage against X type, which is going to be the most important one since you have the least amount of it compared to your other stats. However, if you want to fight Light Dreamers, then instead of using bone-in deviated sausage as your second food buff, just swap it with the other food buff here, which is roulette dumplings for the damage plus 15% against elite enemies. Though here, of course, it's randomly gained, so you'll have to roll it. However, if you are clearing nightmare silos, then once again, you're going to want to focus on mixed fried hot dog. But as your second food buff, you will want to use honey glazed meat for the 15% crit rate when you are hitting enemies affected by Frost Vortex, which is going to be very important because the Pathfinder lacks crit rate. Then for your drink buffs, you're going to want to drink Whimsical Drink for the 25% status damage bonus that it gives to still increase your Frost Vortex damage. Then as your secondary drink buff, if you are bossing and you are using downstar suffix mods, then you will want to make use of Stardust Energy Drink to have the double jump effect so that you are at a height level higher than your enemies. But if not, then you're going to want to use Borscht Deluxe, crafted with meat that gives you Frost Vortex damage bonus so that you make use of some more damage bonuses. Then for your calibration, you will want to prioritize Frugal Style, which is after missing a shot, you'll automatically reload 1 ammo, and the next shot that hits gains 15% attack, which is going to help your penetrating ice spikes damage since it scales off of your attack. Now, if you do not have access to Frugal Style, then of course you could use all of the other sniper options, which could be portable or even stabilized. However, just don't use Rapid Shot Style because it's not going to be affected by the bolt pulling speed and the post fire delay. It will get the 15% reload efficiency, but at the cost of 10% attack. So Rapid Shot Style isn't worth it for this weapon. And now this is where we're going to start splitting the build. So from now on, I'm going to talk about the crit build. And then I'll move on to the Weakspot build. But starting with the crit build, if you're going to go to the crit build, then you'll want to build double crit rate on the calibration substats. Moving on to your suffix and substats priority, starting with your weapon mod and your mask mod, you will want to prioritize keyword suffix mods for the very important Frost Vortex keywords damage bonus. And the reason for this is because you don't have much of it compared to the other stats. Then as linked attribute, look for 6% frost damage bonus, and for general attribute, look for 2 damage bonuses against X type of enemies. Now if you're bossing, then of course you'll want to have your mod rolls roll into a single damage type, not just split themselves between 2. Then moving on to your helmet and to your top mod, if you are on the low HP presets, then you will want to run lunar suffix. So as fixed attribute, you'll want to look for crit damage bonus, and as linked attribute, you will want to look for weapon damage bonus. The reason why we're ignoring status is because status damage, of course, doesn't affect the piercing ice spikes. Then as general attribute, you'll want to look for your damage against X type of enemy. Now, if you are not on the low HP preset, then just use a violent suffix mod with weapon damage as linked attribute and to look for 2 damage bonuses against X type of enemy. Then for your pants mod and for your boots mod, if you are bossing, then you will want to use a downstar mod with crit damage and weapon damage as fixed and linked attribute, and then as general attribute, look for the damage type that you want to have damage bonuses against. However, if you're not bossing, then just stick to a violent suffix so that it'll give you the 2 general attributes of damage against X type of enemy. So you'll look for 6% weapon damage and 2 damage bonuses against X type. The reason for this is because if you're not bossing, then you're fighting multiple types of enemies in the game. So for instance, normal enemies and elite enemies, and those damage lines are more important than just getting some extra crit damage and weapon damage. Then lastly, for your gloves mod, here, if you are on the lowest low HP preset, which is the one using Savior, then you will want to use Crescent Suffix mod. And the reason for this is because it can easily trigger the extra 6% and 15% weapon and crit damage bonuses, which only happen at 40% shield. And then as general attribute, you look for your damage against X type. Now here, if you are not using that preset, so with the Savior, then you don't want to use Crescent because you won't be able to trigger the 40% shield. Hence, your base stats will literally be lower than the base stats that of Violent, which is 15% crit damage and 6% weapon damage bonus. So if you're not using the Savior preset, then you'll want to run a Violent suffix with the usual attributes that I've mentioned. Now moving over to your mods, starting with the Pathfinder's mod, the mod that you will want to prioritize is going to be Cryo Catalyst. The mod now has been fixed, though I don't want to show you just so that I don't make this video any longer than it needs to be, but I can confirm that the mod has been fixed and you will now get the 5% Frost Vortex damage bonus after you trigger a Frost Construct. So this is going to be the best option, and you wouldn't really want to go with the other options, such as Shattering Ice, which is only 50% psi intensity of damage when an enemy is defeated at the center of your Frost Vortex. You also won't want to run Cryoblast because, well, this mod requires you to trigger Frost Vortex to stack up Frost Vortex damage bonus, but the Pathfinder doesn't trigger Frost Vortex quickly enough to stack this effect up, well, quickly enough. And lastly, you don't really want to run Frosty Blessing. It's just a mod that you run to get a little bit more survivability. Then moving on to your secondary weapons mod, you're going to want to run Vulnerability Amplifier for the extra 8% vulnerability that the Bullseye is going to apply. Then for your melee weapon, the mod literally doesn't matter because the mod's effects are only active when you have the weapon with the mod in your hands. And since the Kukri is never used to defeat enemies and only used to destroy ice cubes, you don't need mods for that. Then, moving on to your helmet mod, because we're doing the crit build, as a reminder, you will want to use Fateful Strike to compensate for the lack of crit rate that this weapon has. Not just that, but you also get 30% crit damage. Though here, albeit you won't be able to deal weak spot damage, we're assuming that you're running the crit build because you're just doing AoE mobbing clearing, since you're not going to be focused on hitting their weak spots, which are by default very small. Then, for your mask mod, you will want to use Frost Construct, which is Frost Constructs, so ice spikes that the Pathfinder does as damage will deal extra 10% damage, and if the target is in Frost Vortex status, the damage dealt is increased by another 10%. And this is a separate multiplier from all of the other damage sources, so it's pretty much a 20% separate damage multiplier, which is going to be very important. And here, the alternative option for Frost Vortex weapons are going to be Frostwave Wither, which is Frost Vortex final damage plus 30%, but the Pathfinder doesn't deal most of its damage with Frost Vortex, so this is useless. And now there's also the option for Targeted Strike, which is when hitting marked enemies, you gain 10% crit rate and 25% crit damage. However, this is not going to be a 20% separate damage multiplier from everything else, and you also have to mark your enemy, because here, obviously, if you don't mark your enemy, you will not get the 10% crit rate and 25% crit damage. Then, moving on to your gloves, you will want to prioritize crit boost for the lack of crit rate that this weapon has. So you get 15% crit rate from your gloves. Moving on to the boots, if you are on the low HP preset or even the lowest HP preset, then you will want to use Rush Hour. The reason for this is because every 10% HP loss grants 4% weapon and status damage bonus permanently, which means that if you are on the lowest HP preset, so the one with Savior, you will have a permanent 36% weapon and status damage bonus. However, if you're not using the low HP preset, then you will want to consider either Against All Odds or Covered Advance, depending on your preference on whether if you like to stack your effects or not. Because Covered Advance is a 20% weapon and status damage buff for 30 seconds after taking no damage for 4 seconds. However, if you're using the high HP preset with the Savior set, then you can make great use with Against All Odds, which is for every 5% max HP consumed, you'll gain an additional 5%, lasting for 5 seconds, stacking up to 3 stacks. Then moving on to your top mod, here, if you are on the lowest HP preset, then ideally you will want to use Rejuvenating. And the reason for this is because when your shield is above 30% of max HP, which is easily done, defeating an enemy recovers 20% of your max HP. Now, because your HP is going to be locked from recovering due to the sanity decrease, that recovery is going to be converted into shield, which is going to give you even more survivability. So this is very important if you are using the Savior low HP preset. However, if you're not doing that, then it's going to be pretty hard to have a shield that is above 30% of your max HP. So just pick any gold mod with the best substats so that you deal the most amount of damage. Then, moving on to your pants, since now we're doing the crit version of the build, you will now want to use Deadshot for the stacking crit damage, which is going to be very important. Essentially, each crit hit by non-melee weapons grants plus 5% crit damage, stacking up to 45%. So after 9 shots, you will have stacked this effect up to its max percentage. And now moving on to the weak spot build, I'm just going to enumerate the small differences to make your build into a weak spot build. Starting with the food buff, there's one difference that you need to make when you're clearing nightmare silos for your food slot. You no longer want to use honey glazed meat because this gives crit rate, and if you're using a Weakspot build, you don't make much use of crit rate. So here your options are going to be layered galaxy and crumbly bread, depending on which stat you need more. Then, moving on to your suffix and substats priority, there are a few differences that we need to make, notably for the lunar mods. So starting with the lunar mods, you no longer want to go for crit damage and weapon, you actually want elemental and weapon. However, if you don't use lunar suffix mods, then in that case, you have essentially two options. You have the option between precision and talent suffix. And here the choice should be precision because it will give you weak spot damage bonus and weapon damage bonus. Whereas if you use talent, it'll give you elemental damage bonus, but the status damage line that it gives will not benefit your piercing ice spikes. Then, for your pants mod and your boots mod, if you're going with downstar suffix, again, you do not want to go with crit damage and weapon, you'll want to go with elemental and weapon. And lastly, for the gloves, with the crescent mod, you won't want to go with weapon and crit damage, you'll want to go with elemental and weapon. Now that we're done with the mod suffix and substats priority, let's go over the mod changes. Starting with the helmet mod that you're actually going to want to run is going to be Precise Strike for the insane amount of weak spot damage that you get, which would be 36%. And this is going to be really important to balance out your weak spot to weapon and elemental damage, since weapon and elemental damage are pretty easy to get, but not weak spot damage if you don't build it. Moving on to your gloves, you have essentially three options here. You have the option between elemental overload, you have the option between weapon amplifier, and weak spot damage boost, and following the rule, the goal should be to try to balance out weak spot, weapon, and elemental damage as fairly as possible. Then lastly, for your pants mod, here obviously you won't want to go with Deadshot anymore since Deadshot is a crit mod, so you have two options. In short, you will have elemental resonance, and the other option is going to be unstoppable. Essentially, if you're doing a boss fight and you can easily hit the weak spots and you have the options to stand far away from the boss, then you should use Unstoppable because it can give you up to 40% weak spot damage bonus. However, if not, then simply use Elemental Resonance, which essentially makes it so that for each instance of elemental damage dealt from the previous magazine, the next magazine will gain 1% elemental damage, stacking up to 24%, lasting for 15 seconds. Then, for your weapon calibration, obviously you will not want to go with crit rate anymore, so here you're going to have to go with either double weak spot or double elemental. It doesn't matter if it's elemental or weak spot here, just balance it out somewhere else. So for instance, if you pick double elemental here, for this guide, then pick the weak spot. If you wish to see more quality one-human content, then do like this video, subscribe to my channel, and turn on the bell for future video notifications. As usual, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below. This is Mon, peace out.